And Nate, also thank you. We know after all the dangerous life you've lived, the most dangerous day was last Friday as you were running in the woods and had a little accident.
I have made it through a day. I probably had 1,000 meetings today. I didn't get in the door without Vooch saying, "Hey, what happened to your face?" So, yes, I was running in the woods. I took a stick through my cheek. I have 3 stitches on the inside. It's extraordinarily painful, but it won't stop me from talking. And let me just say, Brad, thank you for your introduction, for your friendship. Despite all that, though, I do hope the club is making Brad's board service extremely expensive. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Brad, thanks for putting it together, because I think everybody in the room here wants to know about this incredible transition you made from Dartmouth, 1999, peacetime, classics major, and then all of a sudden you're in 2 of the longest wars in American history, right at the front. So how do you go from Dartmouth Classics 99 to Hitman Actual?
I suspect a lot of people in this room have been through a similar transition, and the thing that always struck me about the Marine Corps is that at every step along the way, I never felt ready for the next thing until all of a sudden you are. And I think that process of making Marines and winning battles is one that the institution has pretty well dialed since 1775. So by the time you're standing there, somehow you're ready.
Now, your classmates were going off to do many different things, but your study of the classics, was there something that you studied early on that led you to this kind of servant warrior concept?
I mean, look, I think that careers, in my experience, only make sense in hindsight. And when you're moving forward, we're all sort of grasping in a dark room. And I wish I could say that, I read Thucydides and thought, I want to go be a warrior. But it's not true. I mean, in fact, when Brad and I were scrambling to finish our senior theses and couldn't leave campus during our senior year spring break, I remember you smoking in the stacks of the library as we were trying to figure out what we were going to write. I mean, there was no heroic narrative to this. But one thing that I think did stick with me, and part of this was the classics, and part of it was, my dad served in the Army in the late 60s. My grandfather was badly wounded off of Okinawa in 1945. And I do think that there are obligations of citizenship. I mean, at some fundamental level. And it doesn't have to be military service, but we all have to do something. You got to give something back to the society that we're a part of, or else the whole thing doesn't work.
What about your classmates at that time? Like you said, we were getting the peacetime dividend.
Yep.
A lot of guys weren't thinking about the military, but were they thinking of doing other service?
Not really. And not in the moment, and some did over time in different forms. But look, this was the peacetime 1990s. It was, I mean, you're right. It was the peace dividend, and the books that we were reading at that time were "The World Is Flat." Remember that, or "The End of History." Well, I mean, it became abundantly clear in the next 25 years that, in fact, the world was not flat. That was clear to me, again, looking forward. I liked team sports. I liked being outdoors. I wanted to give something back. I wanted to make my dad proud. I wanted to do a hard thing. They were pretty simple human impulses.
Any pushback? Your grandfather was Navy, your father was Army, and you said you're going Marine. Was there any pushback?
I think my parents weren't thrilled. Not for,
especially your mother.
Not for service rivalry reasons, but no, I think my parents weren't thrilled. It wasn't exactly what they had envisioned for me, but they were fundamentally good enough parents to let me chart my own course. My dad told me something that, and he passed away in November. But this one of the most profound things he ever said to me when I was commissioned. He said, "They will teach you everything I love you too much to teach you." I thought that was, now that I'm a father, I think that's actually.
And you can't teach your kid how to swim. You have to have somebody else to do it, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, you need somebody in the world to teach your kid hard things.
What was that most indelible moment that you can remember, either in officer training or your early days of the Marine Corps, that you said, this is a different world? This is a completely different world.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was at OCS. I mean, I think back, this seems so trivial in hindsight, but at the moment it was a big deal. It was jumping into this muddy pond, and if the instructors were upset with you, they would just let you jump in, and you couldn't tell where the snakes were. But if you had done a good job and they wanted to hook you up, they threw a rock in first, so the snakes all came to the surface. And I was thinking, you know, one of my college roommates is a beach lifeguard this summer. What am I doing here?
You're swimming with snakes. What about, you know, Marine Corps takes great pride in the leadership qualities they try to instill in you. Anything that you remember, you say, boy, that's leadership like I've not seen before. A simple thing, not, you know, running into a hail of bullets, but just simple little actions. Was there something that stood out in your mind? Absolutely.
I'll tell you, one of the best leaders I've ever worked for or with in any capacity over my whole career was my company commander in Afghanistan in the fall of '01, Rich Whitmer. And he was a Mustang. He was a white-haired terminal major, and the battalion commander didn't like him, and the regimental commander didn't like him, and the division commander didn't like him. And every time there was a hard thing that had to get done, he got the call. And he was gruff, and he was a little bit borderline insubordinate. And he was the most magnificent leader I've ever worked with. And it wasn't big stuff, Mike, to your point. It was, you just watched him, and he would eat less food, he would drink less water, he would carry more weight, he would sleep less, and then when we were actually doing things, he would expose himself to more danger than anybody else, and he did it very quietly. And I think it was why we loved him. It was why we followed him anywhere.
What were your emotions? You watched 9/11 happen while you were at a bar in Australia, while you guys were deployed, and by the next morning you were on your way to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
It was showtime.
Yep.
Your thoughts as a young lieutenant going into combat?
I was psyched.
Yep.
I mean, you know.
Showtime.
Just to be clear, 8:45 in the morning on the East Coast was not morning in Australia, so we were not sitting at the bar in the early morning. It was evening. It was the end of the day on September 11th. We were there training Australian Army officers to do peacekeeping operations in East Timor. And I had just hung up the phone, talking to my parents. I'd gone back to the bar to sit down with my buddies, and we watched everything happen on CNN or some news station on the TV behind the bar. And yeah, it was like, okay. You know, I remember somebody gave us a ride. Some Australian couple gave us a ride back to the dock where the ships were moored, and the Marines were setting up a tripod-mounted 50 cals on the pier. Before the sun came up the next morning, we were on our way to the North Arabian Sea. And I think the dominant point of view among all of us was, remember those early hours after that attack, everybody was angry. A lot of people were scared. A lot of people thought they might have a friend or a colleague or a family member on the planes or in the buildings. And we felt all of those things, but we also felt like we were actually in a position to do something about it. And that felt good.
And once you got over there, once you were in a combat unit, out setting up patrols, moving, any doubts about your capabilities, personally?
I mean, this is going to sound like hubris, but not really. I mean, lots of doubts along the way, of course. But once we were there, I actually saw people sort of settle into their roles and responsibilities. And there was a certain calm. And look, I think that actually was one of the distinguishing features in the good Marines that I served with, was as things got crazier and crazier around them, they tended to get calmer. Mm-hmm. So look, it was 25 years ago. It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that I'm being revisionist here. But the thing that I actually remember was this incredible kind of respect for the institution that that by the time the chips were down, people seemed generally ready to go.
What about the balancing act that all officers have to do with mission and your people?
Yeah.
Is that the greatest challenge, a leadership challenge that's there no matter how difficult the task is or how big or small the task is?
Yeah. I found that, yes, in a word, to be very difficult. And I think if it's always mission, and nothing about men, look, pretty soon you're going to be standing there by yourself and everybody's dead. But if it's men, then why are we even here? So in my view, and my more senior colleagues may agree or disagree with this, but just as a young officer trying to thread that needle night after night after night after night, I felt like it was always a balancing act. And I was always trying to maintain enough credibility with enough credibility with my Marines that they would continue to follow me. Because, look, leadership in those circumstances, in my experience, it's never by consensus. You're in charge. Make the decision. But it is by consent. You're only the leader as long as the people you're leading still follow you.
You have the legal authority, but when you're out in a combat situation, you have to have the practical authority.
Exactly. So the legal authority in the military is so clear, right? You wear it on your collar or your shoulder. What are ribbons? Ribbons are basically stapling your resume to your chest. And that legal authority, even for a junior second lieutenant, in my experience, it buys you 5 minutes of credibility in a conversation, but it buys you 10 seconds in a firefight. And the thing that carries the day in a firefight is moral authority, not legal authority, but practical authority, as you said. And that accrues to people who, one, know their job, and two, genuinely care for the people in their charge. And in my experience, the people who did that, who were good at their jobs and who took care of their people, over time accrued a lot of moral authority. And the heroes in the organization were the junior people who had a lot of moral authority. And the goats are the senior people who have none.
Exactly. And
Which isn't to say all the senior people have none. There are a lot, but the handful of seniors who have none, or the handful of juniors who have a ton, those are the interesting folks.
And you mentioned the book. You had a mission where all of a sudden you were given an order where you had to hump a lot of gear. I don't know if it was unnecessary gear or whatever, but they decided to use your vehicles to move something else, and you thought, that's just a dumb idea. And it's not that you didn't want to hump the gear, but it was just tactically and practically a dumb idea coming from above. How do you deal with that?
I mean, yeah, that was one particular night movement in Afghanistan. It was a long distance over rocky ground. And I had a weapons platoon at the time, and we had a lot of mortar rounds to carry. And I mean, it was pushing a couple 100 pounds per guy. It was a lot of weight and a long distance in the dark on uneven ground. And the battalion ops staff decided that they would all ride instead of humping anything. And it was like, guys, how about we put some rounds in the trucks and everybody walks and doesn't carry any weight? It seemed like a common sense solution, but the ops officer didn't want to hear it. So,
as the operation moved on, there came a very critical point in the whole Afghan campaign where you thought there was kind of a breakdown in leadership from above, and that was towards the end at Tora Bora.
So I remember General Mattis being incensed about this. He at that point had come in to take command of Task Force 58, which was the 15th MU from the West Coast and the 26th MU from the East. And he was a one-star at the time. And the intelligence picture was coming together to put bin Laden and the senior al-Qaeda leadership at Tora Bora, a cave complex in eastern Afghanistan. And the initial op plan was for the Marines to go fly up and cordon off the valleys. This is Christmas time, there was deep snow in the mountains. So the only way you could really get around was in the valleys, but cordon off the valleys and then drop a lot of bombs on Tora Bora and bottle them up and let them die under the bombardment or flee into the cordon. And then there was a deal done, and the Afghans did the cordon operation instead of the Americans. And I think that was the moment when bin Laden and a lot of the senior leadership escaped across the border into Pakistan.
At the end of the day, and in hindsight, was it indecision or a bad decision from higher authority?
I actually don't know where that decision was made, but I know it was far above our CG, and it was certainly a bad decision. Whether we got to that via indecision, I don't know. But I think at that point early on there was this sense that the Afghans had routed the British, they had routed the Russians, that we needed to stay very, very light. I still think that operation could have been done while keeping things very light. And it was only later, the Bonn conference happened just after that, which was this NATO development conference. And then the mission, in my view, the mission creep began. And it went from kind of a pretty narrowly focused counterterrorism mission. And
Hearing the buzz about Iraq while you were still in Afghanistan?
certainly hearing about it when I got back. So I got back in the spring of '02, late spring of '02, and we went to the Mountain Warfare Training Center in the High Sierra in Eastern California to do a mountain warfare package in anticipation of going back to Afghanistan. And then it was sort of ironic, a few months later, we ended up in the flat desert. And so, look, I mean, and the narrative that emerged later that resources were not diverted from Afghanistan to Iraq, look, from my perspective as somebody who was in one of those units at the time, that's absolutely not true. Resources were unequivocally diverted from the mission in Afghanistan to Iraq.
So on a personal level, now you make the switch to Reconnaissance Battalion, and for people who are strangers to the Marine Corps, that is one of the more elite units in the Marine Corps, and they take the finest enlisted men, finest officers, and they have the most difficult assignments. And so now you've upped the ante a little bit in leadership. You're leading a really intense crew of highly trained, highly professional people. Did you feel you had to change your leadership to adapt to that?
I did. So it was interesting. The recon platoon that I ended up getting assigned was the same recon platoon that had been with us in Afghanistan on the MU. So I knew a lot of these guys, which was helpful. And all the ranks are bumped up one, basically. So the team leaders were staff sergeants, the platoon sergeant's a gunny, maybe even a master sergeant, and the platoon commander's a captain. And I knew these guys from Afghanistan. I'd served with them on the ground for months, and it was an older, more operationally experienced, more highly trained group. It was a little bit more consultative, a little bit more back and forth.
But if anybody's seen Generation Kill, the HBO series that was done on Nate's unit in Iraq and the invasion, they were a wild bunch too. I mean, these guys are pretty hardy guys who are really looking for a fight.
Yeah, it was a wild bunch, that's for sure.
And how did you feel? Here's a Dartmouth guy, a classics major, dealing with some of these guys who are coming from vastly different backgrounds.
I thought I was a part of the Hardy Bunch too. They were really fundamentally an awesome group of guys, and many of them. And I'll just go into the future here for a minute to give you a sense of them before we go back. So, our SARC, our Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman, went to med school afterward. Now he's the director of an emergency room in Philadelphia. Wow. Half the guys in the platoon already had college degrees. They had just chosen to be enlisted Marines because they liked the mission more. A bunch of them stayed in. I've gone to many senior enlisted retirement ceremonies, 20 years later, and they were operationally experienced. There were not a lot of people in 2003. Not a lot of sergeants and staff sergeants, corporals, sergeants, and staff sergeants in the Marine Corps in 2003 who already had a combat tour or two under their belts. Mm-hmm. So it was an operationally experienced crew. It was a tough bunch of guys.
And the way you were portrayed in the film, and we talked about it, we thought the first two episodes were pretty legit, yeah. And then it kind of went Hollywood after that. But nevertheless, it looked like your most difficult role was justifying to this pretty hardy group of warriors, yeah. What decisions were coming down the line, and you had to put a good face on it so that they would follow the orders and complete the mission.
I remember one night in particular, we'd been doing forward reconnaissance for the 1st Marine Division as it moved north through central Iraq toward Baghdad. And working directly for General Mattis. And as a matter of fact, the best order I ever got in my time in the Marine Corps was one directly from the general at one point during that march up, where he looked at me and he said, Lieutenant or Captain, attack north and develop the situation.
Commander's intent.
That was like it was the best order I ever got.
Yeah.
And I try to remember that now when I give
Are there
people
any
on my team
questions? Are there any
instructions.
questions?
Great. Take your compass, go that direction, and figure it out.
Yeah.
And one night in particular, to your point about having to sort of sell decisions, one night in particular, we'd been getting attacked and ambushed every day, every night on this march north, and finally we were going to turn it on them, and we were going to go out one night on an ambush patrol across the river on our own to go try to get some of these guys who were setting up to hit the division the next day. And I had my map on the hood of the Humvee, and I briefed the team leaders, and I had this one crusty old team leader from rural North Carolina named Sean Patrick, and he shook his head and he looked at me and he said, where I come from, we have a saying, never pet a burning dog. I still don't really know what it means, but I can sort of figure out what it means.
Something's up here. I got to think this out a little bit better.
But a few hours later, as we're getting hit from 3 sides, and the only time in my experience in the Marine Corps where we did not have for a long while fire superiority, I was thinking in my head, damn it, we pet the burning dog. Here we go, getting out over our ski tips, and they knew it, and they didn't want to do it, and it's not because they were cowards, it was because they knew it was a stupid plan, and they were right.
Yeah, but you talk about the compass, figuring out where to go. Probably the most difficult compass to operate in those situations is the moral compass. Yeah. You have to set the direction for that unit. Yeah. And the rules of engagement changed on the hour by the kilometer over there. Yep. How did you feel? How did you handle that? I mean, did you had to keep an open mind to it? Did you have to adjust with the situation and the terrain?
Yeah. The civilians as cover. It was very hard to get clean shots. And there was one night that we were racing. We were supposed to do reconnaissance on a military airfield, and a British parachute unit was going to seize the field. Something happened to them, and we got the order to seize the field. So sort of a last-minute airfield seizure order.
And what were the rules of engagement at that point?
They changed. So the rules of engagement at that point had been that you could only fire in response to a kind of clear hostile act or hostile intent. And given that we thought this was a military airfield, that we now were going to go seize it, on the radio as we're about to bust through the fence, I get the order that anybody on the field is declared hostile. Just preemptively declared
free fire zone.
Free fire zone.
Free fire zone.
Free fire zone. And so we were coming through one gate, another unit was coming through another gate, and I had one handset from my hire and one handset to my team, and I thought for a minute about not passing on that change in the rules of engagement, because it didn't feel right to me. But then I thought, well, if I don't, and the lead vehicle disappears in a ball of fire, that's going to be hard for me to explain to the parents of those Marines. So I did pass it on. And I heard the chatter of a machine gun up ahead, and it turned out later that we had shot a couple of kids who were on the field. And the other unit commander had the same hesitation that I had, and then he concluded, that's a stupid change, and he didn't pass it on.
And you go on to say in that incident that you really had to push very hard to try to resolve that situation with the wounded kids.
Yeah.
And you were having a hard time selling that through to the higher ups.
So the argument that they made was, look, we have very limited medical resources, we have very limited airlift, and we need to prioritize wounded Americans. And I said, I get it. And like, we got a bunch of Americans here who just shot a couple of kids because, you know, you changed the rules of engagement in a way that frankly didn't make a lot of sense. And so there are two kinds of wounds. You've got physical wounds, but I've got a bunch of guys now who need to maintain their confidence that we're the good guys, or else I'm going to have a very hard time keeping them in the fight tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So I actually think that evacuating these kids is an important part of keeping our unit combat effective.
Now, I preface it, the guys you were with, pretty hardy guys.
Yeah.
They were looking for fights.
Yeah.
They were real warriors. But how do you balance that with the absolute necessity to keep the moral high ground out there?
Look, I mean, this gets back to the Marine Corps, you know, making Marines and building culture. Yeah, they were hardy warriors, but they were not barbarians. You know, they fought within a framework, if you will, and a real conviction that they were the good guys.
And when you have to go back and face these people, these troops, and like you say, they had ranks, but now the junior NCOs have more authority now than most servicemen had through the whole generations of the military, because you guys pushed more authority down to them, weren't you?
I think one of the things that, you know, certainly a leadership lesson that I learned in the Marine Corps that I, again, have tried to keep alive in other roles has been pushing decision-making authority down and out in an organization. And it's the only way you get speed. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I think you get better decisions because you got to give people autonomy who are closest to the problem.
How difficult was having that transparency, having a reporter with you? I know when I went to my unit as an embedded reporter, there was a lot of suspicion at the very beginning. Now you knew someone was going to be watching everything you were doing that wasn't in the chain of command.
So the battalion commander called me into his tent one night in Kuwait, and he said, Nate, we have a journalist from Rolling Stone. He's going to ride with your platoon. I said, sir, with all due respect, I'd rather not. And he said, Nate, we have a journalist from Rolling Stone. He's going to ride with you. And I said, aye, sir. And so the reporter, Evan, and I went out to dinner in the chow tent and quickly established our ground rules. And the deal was he agreed not to give away our plan, because he had a satellite phone, and not to get in the way when things got crazy. And in return, he could talk to anybody, anytime about anything. And if he was going to be censored, it wasn't by me.
A lot of people said at the end of the day, that was good for both sides. That the transparency, you know, there was no pulling punches on either side, from the reporter side and the military side. It was all out there.
Look, I actually thought it was great. What are the alternatives, right? It was sort of more like Ernie Pyle in World War II than, remember the Gulf War, where, you know, some general will come out on a stage in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia and brief the press pool every day. That didn't seem to capture what was going on. I think it's probably the best, it seemed to me to be the best option in a democratic society. I think it basically worked. And, you know, the guy who was with us, Evan, I remember thinking that he wouldn't last very long, that he would eventually raise his hand and say, hey, I'm out of here. And after our first real close quarters firefight, I found him on his knees counting the bullet holes in the door that he'd been sitting next to, because there were no armored Humvees at this point. And there were a bunch of holes. Like these, you know, rounds had passed over his lap. And I was thinking, like, if I were him, right, I would have at that point probably said, hey, guys,
he didn't take the oath.
This has been great. I'm going to the Hyatt in Kuwait City, and I'm going to file my story. He didn't do that, though. He stayed with us to the very end. He was in a lot of fights. And I think that the Marines, I know the Marines, and I grew to really respect them for it. And I think the stuff that he wrote and then the show that he made, by and large, were really good.
You know, it's interesting, someone will be talking to you and say, boy, hey, you ought to write a book or you ought to do a movie. Well, you got a book and you got the movie. It's quite a story all the way through. So the next transition, you leave the military.
Yeah.
Any second thoughts about leaving the military? I mean, were you done?
You know, I had a good follow-on assignment. I was going to go run the Marine Recon School in San Diego. Great job. Living on the beach, you know, jumping and diving, and I mean, it would have been awesome. And our generation, you know, the people who were, who went through Quantico or Parris Island or San Diego in the late 90s, kind of by virtue of timing and circumstance, we got to do a lot of stuff. And I felt like there were other things I wanted to go do. So I got out, not because of any negative thing, just I wanted to go do other things.
So other things, you go to Harvard Business School and you go to the Harvard Kennedy School. In the back of your mind, did you still think service was going to be a major component to whatever was next?
I sort of, but not back in government. So the thing, as I thought about what I liked in the Marine Corps, I liked building and leading teams. And I wanted to find a way to keep building and leading teams as a civilian, which is why I went to business school. Frankly, it was a way to tread water and figure out what to do with my life without my parents being too upset with me. And I gravitated to the early stage side of things. I wanted to, you know, build and lead organizations, but they had to have some mission component, which is how I ended up running this national security research organization for 4 years, and then building a cybersecurity software business, which again had that mission element to it. So I scratched that service itch by focusing on things that I thought still had some kind of mission.
I had a lot of comments from people that I was embedded with that went back to graduate school. And I remember getting calls to them saying, Mike, this isn't working for me. These people don't understand teamwork like I know it.
Yeah.
This whole concept of leadership, it's different. Here, it's every person for themselves. And in fact, I had one guy who was at USC's business school and said, I'm dropping out. I said, no, you can't drop out.
Yeah.
This is what you're going to find in business and in life going forward. Adjust to it now. Did you have a little adjustment there too?
So I had a big adjustment, of course, but and Harvard has a tough reputation right now for a lot of good reasons. But Harvard Business School at that moment in time was a magnificent place for veterans. 10% of the class was vets, and because of the timing, most of us were combat vets. And so that was 90 people, or almost 100 people in a class of 900.
So that changes the culture quite a bit.
Totally. And so there was a great cohort of people. And by and large, a faculty that really appreciated the different perspective that we brought to the table. And every now and then you had the outlier, but no, generally speaking, it was actually a terrific place for us.
So after that training, very sophisticated training, you went up for at a think tank in Washington, Center for New American Security.
Yeah.
Sometimes you look at these think tanks and say, what do these guys really do?
Yeah.
I mean, so in your tool sets, what you experience, you're a pretty hands-on guy. Yeah. You would think it would be difficult for you to be sitting in a policy position.
Yeah. I was sitting in a policy position, but the work that we were doing was sort of being tasked by people like General McChrystal at that point. It was very relevant, direct work. I went back to Afghanistan 4 times while I was there in different
more than policy, yeah.
So it was more, it was policy, but it was pretty edgy policy. So it still felt very relevant. I mean, I think about it now, I don't think we got everything right. I think that some of the work that we were doing was probably part of the problem in advocating for kind of more sustained engagement than was probably smart in places like Afghanistan.
But having gone to war now, were you starting to realize that the art of warfare was changing substantially? History was changing substantially? Yep. Did you have a sense how fast everything was changing now?
I had some early inklings. So we had a couple of really good people on our team who left, and one went to go do all Asia Pacific work, and another left to go do all technology work. And I think back now, and I'm like, they saw something. They had enough distance from the issue at hand to have a pretty smart kind of glimpse into what was going to matter most later.
But even at that time, did you fully sense, like I think you do now, that cyberspace and technology warfare is probably the next greatest threat to our national security?
there was no like crystallizing moment for me. The big thing was I'd not gone to business school intending to run a nonprofit. That opportunity came my way, and I jumped at it to lead something. And then I wanted to get back on the company building track that I'd gone to business school to do. And again, I wanted to find a way to find, the mission. And so cybersecurity was, for me, something that was still very connected to kind of a national security mission, but it was a chance to build a technology business, which was what I wanted to do. I mean, that was the interesting thing to do with that. It still is. I mean, that in our era, if you want to build a big consequential business pretty quickly, it's got to be almost certainly has to be a tech or tech-enabled business.
But it could have been social media or something else. But you have a national security background.
I did not want to build the next, dating app or ride-sharing app or food delivery app, whatever. So it had to be something in the mission.
So as you were developing, and you developed two very successful cybersecurity companies, then did you start connecting the dots about what does this mean for our country in the future?
Yes, it started to feel like tech innovation as a source of national power and influence was increasingly foundational. And I mean something really specific by that. It was more like, is more like geography or demography or natural resources than it is like these traditional measures of strength, like GDP or military capacity. Because more and more, our GDP is downstream of tech innovation. Our military capacity, at this point I would argue US military capacity in hardware, not in training. Because I still think the way we look at the way the Russians, like junior officers and NCO leadership, functionally don't exist in the Russian military, which is why part of the reason we're seeing them, what's happening. But from an equipment standpoint, all of our military capacity is downstream of tech.
And you've gone out and said that you think that technology superiority or innovation is more important than GDP or military.
I had the Secretary of State here at the RSA conference yesterday to make that case. This is the biggest security conference in the world, 40,000 people in San Francisco this week, talking about cybersecurity and other things. And the main stage keynote was the Secretary of State saying exactly that.
So you make the transition to government. You get selected to be the first U.S. ambassador to cyberspace and digital affairs. A very lofty title, but not so lofty swearing-in ceremony. What happened?
You're good, you do your research. So, yes, Mike is right. I thought, wow, an ambassador, this is going to be some fancy ceremony in Washington or something. I got a phone call. They said, hey, I got confirmed by the Senate, and I was at home in Maine. And I got a phone call from the department, and they said, hey, we need you to leave in 2 days to go to Romania on the first thing we need you to do. And you need a diplomatic passport. And the only way to get it fast enough is you got to go find a notary public and get sworn in right now.
So here you are with your family, becoming an ambassador.
So I go to the UPS store in a strip mall in South Portland, Maine. And I raise my right hand, and the notary gives me the oath. And there's literally a line of people behind me waiting to mail their packages who are not impressed with what's happening at the front of the line.
But you had to hit the ground running. It was Ukraine. The war was on. Did you sense the cybersecurity threat there?
Yes. I mean, the urgency. So I've spent about half of the last 2 years I've spent overseas. And by far, the place that I've spent the most time is the eastern flank of NATO. Ukraine, Poland, Romania, the Baltics.
In those early days, I mean, could you see the threat? I mean, you had security clearances and whatever. You're close and you're in the region. Was it pretty obvious to you that technology was going to play a large role in this war?
Yes, without a doubt. And I mean, I'll give you some really concrete examples. In terms of things that we the United States did, to help Ukraine early on, all having to do with tech and all having to do with the private sector. This was the government helping, but it was really the private sector doing. One, we worked with Microsoft to migrate the Ukrainian government enterprise to the cloud in February of 22.
To keep them functioning.
Yeah, so it enabled the Ukrainian government to continue to function, communicate, even as their physical communications infrastructure got destroyed, because all of that, all their government data, all their systems were backed up. Second, with the Poles, we provided them with 28,500 Starlink terminals.
And Starlink was a way that you could have instant communications, make telephone calls, and be able to communicate.
Absolutely, and battlefield communications, and they got pretty creative in using the terminals for other things, for their, which created problems later. But Starlink terminals were essential, and then I go everywhere now, and people say, "Why haven't there been more Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine?" There have been a ton of Russian cyber attacks in Ukraine, but because of the threat intelligence feedback sharing loop among the Ukrainian government, the US government, and the big technology companies with infrastructure in Ukraine, they've pushed patches and updates so quickly that they've basically blunted the majority of those Russian attacks.
Now, you're supposed to be in a diplomatic role. Now you're into a warfighting role at this point, almost, aren't you? I mean, you're not carrying a weapon or whatever, but your focus is now, how do we stay in this game and keep our ally going?
There is, we have to be a little bit careful, obviously, and draw some lines between kind of the military and diplomatic sides of things. But yeah, I mean, and this is an interesting thing, and I'll say this as a military veteran. I don't think our diplomats get enough credit. There are no yellow ribbons on cars for diplomats. But they're there.
Well, your mission is to support the foreign policy of the United States, and there's a war on with an ally, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah, and they are very much in the firing line. Last time I was in Ukraine, there was a huge Russian missile barrage that morning, and I get the alerts on my phone when our folks in our embassy are going to the bunker, and I mean they haven't gotten a good night's sleep in 2 years. They're in the bunker 3 times every night.
But your main job now is to, if I understand correctly, is to set up the guardrails for international cyberspace and get countries with a lot of different objectives and agendas to agree to fundamental procedures of running cyberspace.
Yes. So foundationally, the position that the United States takes is that the rules that we've developed in the real world need to extend into the digital world. We don't need to build a whole new set of rules.
Now, it's controlling the seas, trade in the seas.
That's right.
International trade and security.
We've
done this before.
Yeah, freedom of navigation. There are analogs of freedom of navigation, the Geneva Convention, the whole body of human rights law that's developed over time. Just war theory, principles like non-combatant immunity or proportionality. We've got to port these things over into the digital world. We shouldn't be starting with a blank slate, because if we start with a blank slate, we're going to end up with a lot of other influences from places like Russia or China that are going to not agree to building an architecture that looks like what we've developed over the last 70 years in the real world.
Same old problems, same people, same suspects. You can't sell them on the idea, and they're going to fight you all the way on it?
So, it's a fight. I'm going from here to New York to try to put a stick in the spokes of something the Russians are trying to do with the UN. So the United Nations matters in this area, and I'll caveat that a little bit. Over time, a lot of ground game diplomacy by the United States over 20 years has resulted in something called the Framework for Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace, which every UN member state has agreed to. It's the basic rules of the road governing how we act in the digital world and make sure it doesn't become a free-for-all. Not naive. Obviously our adversaries and competitors don't always play by the rules that they themselves have, ostensibly agreed to.
So everybody's on board theoretically.
Everybody is rhetorically on board. Now they don't act that way. So then the question is, okay, what do you do to deter the transgressions? And that's where obviously it gets interesting.
So what do you think are the greatest transgressions and threats to the United States?
I was in Beijing last week with the secretary, and we spent 5 hours with the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, and one of the things that we raised was the Chinese are holding American critical infrastructure at risk in a lot of places. There's been public reporting on things like the water system in Guam, some random stuff like the airport in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
But Guam being a key place now in.
Well, if you want to flow American forces forward in the Pacific.
The Marines
right,
are moving in there.
exactly.
It's a very strategic place now.
Yes. And interestingly, some of the largest aircraft maintenance facilities in the United States are in Tulsa, so that airport matters too. So there's a method to this madness.
But
so-
could you get a sense that it was an organized, planned attempt to disrupt our infrastructure?
Yes.
And when you confronted the Chinese with that, did they back off? They deny? What do they say?
So let me first say a word about how we do that. So there's a global community of security researchers. Many of them are in San Francisco this week for this conference. And the first thing we need to do when these Chinese or other intrusions are detected is you have to do the empirical, analytical, forensic research so that you're actually making an argument that's technical, not an argument that's political.
So was it easy to
So-
find their fingerprints?
Yes, easy to verify. Don't take our word for it. Talk to a security researcher in Moldova or Argentina or Japan or Kenya, and he or she will tell you the same thing. So first it has to be analytically sound in that way. And then the second thing is build a coalition of countries that will sign on to the attribution to stand alongside us. And that's for the simple fact that, I mean, it's kindergarten rules. It's easy to pick on one kid on the playground. It's really hard to pick on 30 kids. So get 30 countries together to do the attribution. So the most recent series of Chinese intrusions, the NSA calls Volt Typhoon. We did the forensic analysis. We built the coalition around it. We did the public attribution of Volt Typhoon and accused the Chinese of doing it. And then we presented the foreign minister with that claim. And have been very vocal about it with the Chinese multiple times. And they challenge the attribution.
Can you see any results? Can you see less attacks on an infrastructure site or less threat to a site? Have you seen it dialed back a bit?
So there was a moment in time in 2015 when the U.S. and the Chinese governments basically reached an agreement on this, and there was a decline for a while. I don't think we see that right now.
All right, so that's the Chinese. Now let's go to Russia. They don't seem to be targeting infrastructure, but they're targeting misinformation campaigns.
Yeah.
A completely different agenda.
It is.
So how do you deal with that one?
This one, I think, in many ways is harder. So Russia is a more isolated country right now than China is, but the disinformation campaigns are harder to combat. We're constrained here by domestic politics. We're constrained by some very good things like the First Amendment, and it's very hard to challenge speech in the United States. One thing that I would say, based on where I sit now, is I don't think most people appreciate how much of the inflammatory content they see online is active intelligence operations by our adversaries.
It's a plan.
It is a well-executed, concerted plan that is explicitly designed in order to sow discord and heighten chaos in the United States.
Does that keep you up at night 7 months away from an election?
It does, yeah, indeed. Indeed. I was meeting with Cyber Command folks here today. So the Department of Homeland Security is generally responsible for defending U.S. critical infrastructure. Cyber Command is responsible for reaching out and touching those who may attack our infrastructure, including election infrastructure. And the State Department's responsible for the diplomatic engagement to call out misbehavior and to try to put the pieces in place to deter it.
What about the just old-fashioned ransom attacks?
Yeah.
Corporation stuff. That seems to be, North Koreans are more into that area.
Yeah, it's like robbing banks, right? It's where the money is. So it's a hard, I think we have to shift the incentives. So what we've tried to do there is, and just to be clear on this, ransomware is when a cyber actor can come and lock down the data in an organization generally. So my little neighborhood community association recently got locked down by a ransomware actor. But it happens to big hospital systems, it happens to schools, and if there's a silver lining here, it's that some of these cyber attacks can feel pretty distant. Like if your big Wall Street bank where you do your retail banking gets attacked, it's pretty transparent to us as the end user, as the consumer. They tend to, we get essentially insured against that. But ransomware, on the other hand, has a direct impact on individual people. Your medical appointment gets canceled. Your surgery gets delayed. Your kid can't access his or her transcript. And so it drives the point home to individual citizens. So what we've done is built a coalition now of 60 countries in something called the Counter Ransomware Initiative. And we're starting to unify policies across this big swath of the globe in order to shift the incentives to try to change the behavior of the ransomware actors.
How much leverage does the United States have in taking a leadership role in this area?
It's been encouraging to see that American power and influence still really matter in the world.
It's being questioned in many areas.
It is, and when the U.S. takes a step back, others fill the void in ways that actually the rest of the world tends not to like.
So we hear the complaints that Huawei and some of the large Chinese companies, they can get these deals because they're going to throw in a stadium or a highway or the Belt Road Link Initiative or something like this.
Yep.
So now you've gotten a little bit of budget to throw some money on the table.
Yeah.
Is that going to be enough to stem what the Chinese are throwing out there?
Not alone, no. I was in Latin America recently and talking to a digital ministry that was entertaining bids to rebuild its 5G telecom infrastructure. And they had a bid from a big European company with technology that we would agree is trusted and secure, and it was a $400 million bid. The Chinese bid from Huawei was $0 and a highway. So like where I grew up, we sort of believed you get what you pay for, or there's no such thing in life as free lunch. So I think we're getting better now at explaining to countries that they have to look at the total cost of ownership, that if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And there's something here that you need to look a layer or two deeper. And enough of these Belt and Road projects have been exposed as essentially intelligence or influence operations.
All right, so given that environment,
Yeah.
you just get in the recent budget agreement that got passed through, you get $50 million to start trying to win hearts and minds.
Yep.
It seems like just a drop in the bucket.
It's a drop in the bucket. So it's a pilot is how I would describe it. I used to tell the sales team at my company, we are never going to celebrate the wins. We're going to celebrate the renewals. Because anybody will take a flyer. They'll buy your thing once. You're actually not allowed to celebrate that. You're only allowed to celebrate when they actually know you and they choose to work with you again. So I look at this as a pilot, and it's incumbent on us now to deliver outsized returns in the next year so that next year it doesn't get increased by 10%, it gets 5x'd. And we've got some good projects in the hopper that I think will help do that.
Given what you have to do now, maybe I should ask Brad this. I mean, did you ever thought of yourself as being a diplomatic person by nature, and then going through the Marine Corps and all the think tanks and whatever? How do you put together the tool sets to do what you have to do now, the leadership things you have to do now?
So in the Marine Corps, we used to talk about the last 100 yards. This idea that you got this huge institution behind you, billions of dollars of budget, millions of people, but it all comes to a point sometimes, like on a bridge in the middle of the night, and it's a couple of people with rifles, and over there a couple other people with rifles, and across that last 100 yards. And in diplomacy, Secretary Blinken talks about the last 3 feet. It's the same thing. You got billions of dollars, millions of people, but you walk into a room and it's a table and there's somebody across the table and you reach out and shake hands and it's across that 3 feet and you either get something done or you don't. So they're actually pretty similar.
Marine officers are trained to be fairly aggressive.
Diplomats need to be aggressive too.
But do you find yourself having to hold on to the table a little bit when you hear the mumbo jumbo and someone spinning you and doing the rope-a-dope on you,
Yep.
do you feel like going across the top of the table at some point? Which would not be very diplomatic, would be very Marine-like.
I feel like it.
You
but
feel like it, okay. So how you control that urge?
So, it's interesting. I have been in the room with Russians in many places, usually never in Russia and usually not in the United States, usually in third places like Geneva or Vienna. And I actually think that there was a really good piece in Foreign Affairs maybe a year ago written by a Russian diplomat who left the diplomatic service to protest basically what they were doing in Ukraine. And he talked about how every time he went abroad on a diplomatic mission, the goons at home would be watching his kids, and so he never, he always had to hew to the line, or else something catastrophic was going to happen. And the Russians across the table, they've got the security guys on the wall behind them. They're clearly, I'm not saying they don't agree with the policy. Like, I think they're happy to represent Mr. Putin sometimes.
They drank the Kool-Aid, but there's a little bit of a threat there.
But look, I think the best diplomacy is you need the veiled, you need the mailed fist and you need the velvet glove. You need both. And ultimately, diplomacy is backed up by military force. And I do believe, though, that diplomacy has to be the country's tool of first resort. It has to be. We cannot start with the military. That is a violation of the sacred obligation that I think we have to the young men and women who are in uniform. We have to lead with diplomacy, and everywhere and all the time. It doesn't mean we only do diplomacy, but look, I think diplomacy is essential, and it's most important when it's most challenging.
Do you feel you're just as much in the fight now, doing what you're doing, as you were in Afghanistan or Iraq?
I mean, look, I don't want to, not in a physical sense.
No, but when you get up in the morning, the tension.
Without a doubt, yes, very much so. I mean, look what's happening in the world. So I think everybody feels that way. Everybody I work with feels that way and acts that way. Yeah.
Is your greatest diplomatic test telling your 2 teenage daughters that you're going to cancel TikTok?
So it's funny. I am the least popular father in their school for that reason. But look, I think that's my opinion. Look, I don't think the U.S. government should be in the business of censoring, media platforms. TikTok, based on what I've seen and read, is a tool of the Chinese Communist Party to collect data on American citizens and to launch influence operations to affect how we think about world events. And this is not a ban. It is a forced divestiture. The goal, TikTok is terrible. It has no value at all. It's awful. But I don't care about that. We can remove the national security concern if it's divested. And that actually is as far as my remit goes.
But on the flip side, we are pushing our iCloud services, our American companies who supply iCloud services, and we don't want foreign governments getting in that business. So how do you kind of, I know the cloud business is different than TikTok.
It's different. So I would be a little bit more apples to apples in the comparison. So China does not allow TikTok in China. TikTok is banned in China. Facebook is banned in China. YouTube is banned in China. They're all banned in China. So, okay, if we're going to talk equivalence, let's go apples to apples. I think that the U.S. cloud providers are. Look, I'll say this as a former tech executive. There are security benefits, cost benefits, operational efficiency benefits to using the cloud. Most organizations should use the cloud. Should foreign intelligence services use the American cloud? Probably not. But that's the 1%, not the 99%.
Nate, thank you so much for sharing your insights on this. We wish you a lot of luck with your family and your teenage daughters, however TikTok is resolved. And we thank you for your incredible service, both in the military and the service you're providing for our country now.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was fun.
We have some questions, Nate, for you that that JJ and Boots will help share.
Reports of when a plan comes together.
Was that the Chinese or the Russians or the Koreans?
You know, with me in the room, who knows?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Like it happens.
Reports of patriotism on Generation Z suggest an all-time low. How do you think that this is affecting our military?
So I'm pretty recruiting numbers. Here. That seems not eligible,
Not
for,
eligible.
for one reason
for
or
legal
another.
reasons, academic reasons, or physical reasons.
That's a problem. I mean, I think the broader issue is back to, I think we need to inculcate in people a sense that we all have to contribute something.
So you're part of the 1%. And do you think this country is going to have to expand a broader reach of people who are serving to?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we need. I do think we still need to do it in a voluntary way. I mean, you know, look, I am grateful to have served in an all-volunteer force. I think it's when I speak to people of my dad's generation who served in a conscripted military, they had a much harder challenge than we had. Everybody I served with wanted to be there. I think we walk away from that at our peril.
Sort of the next question. How does the government help companies guard their intellectual property, especially technological advancements?
Yeah, a bunch of things. So I'd start by saying for a generation, 20 or 30 years, our adversaries, and particularly China, have been stealing IP from the U.S. economy, from our defense industrial base, from our government systems, from our innovation economy, and it's created a couple of distinct problems. One, it's allowed the Chinese to leapfrog in some critical technology areas, but it's also, there's like an even more pernicious second order effect, because when they leapfrog to market competitiveness based on theft of that IP, then they end up, with government subsidies, end up undercutting other businesses on price. And so as the other European or American or Japanese or Australian, whatever, businesses have to lower their price, it ends up compressing their R&D budgets, and then they end up falling behind. And it's really why the U.S. telecom industry basically died. Bell Labs, Motorola.
Yeah, who's left? I mean,
Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, they're all non-American companies. So the point is, a lot of IP has been stolen. What can the American government do to help? A couple of things. First, impose some standards on the companies to maintain basic cyber hygiene. Yes, the companies have had their IP stolen, and it is also true that sometimes the companies have been really boneheaded in how they have failed to protect their own stuff. So there has to be some basic hygiene that is required on critical things. The second thing the U.S. government can do is extend deterrence into the cyber domain. The Chinese don't send, the Russians, whomever, don't send, North Koreans, Iranians, don't send generally teams of agents into the U.S. to break into offices and steal IP, because we have set declaratory and escalatory policies to deal with that. They do it via digital means because they know they can get away with it. So the thing the government has to do is make sure that we're responding to those things with every bit of our diplomatic and economic and informational, and frankly, if necessary, military power.
Is there kind of a mutually assured destruction here in this cyberspace world?
Not really, because the problem is nobody else has anything that we want to steal.
But let's just say take down, react. If we didn't like something that the country did to us,
yeah,
and we said, well, we have the capacity to just take down your whole technology system.
Do we have the capacity? I think to some extent the U.S. has the capacity. I think we're reluctant to take the gloves fully off in this domain for good reason, because we generally are a more digitized society, so we are more vulnerable. So I think we have to be pretty measured in our response.
Is that a hard sell diplomatically with others to say,
Yeah.
hey, let's talk before anyone goes the full route here?
Well, I mean, look, I can speak to public reporting. There's been public reporting that we give things to Ukraine. We say, okay, use this for your defense. And then we pick up conversations of the Ukrainians going, how do we shoot this thing at Moscow? So, you know, there's a degree of having to hold allies and partners back for our common good.
Outstanding. In your current role as Ambassador for Cyber, what do you see as key concepts important for our nation and actionable by leaders and innovators in the Bay Area related to the best for our nation now?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things that we try to advocate for, I'll give you a concrete example. If AI, if artificial intelligence is kind of the next foundational technology that's going to change everything, it's really important that we maintain innovation as the North Star in establishing policies in this area. So I'll give you an example. The White House started by developing a set of voluntary commitments. This is what it sounds like. It was the companies, the 7 leading AI developers agreeing, 7 leading AI businesses agreeing to a set of commitments that are voluntary for them. So voluntary, by definition, is not going to constrain innovation. Voluntary is fast, so it lets you put a governance architecture in place quickly. Those voluntary commitments, diplomatically now, we've ported into the G7, the G20, these other international bodies, the UN, so that they become basically the dominant operating system in the world around AI governance. So a principle in the San Francisco area, to answer the question, kind of maintain the vibrancy of the U.S. innovation economy. Ultimately, we need to run faster than our competitors over time. I think we need to maintain our kind of coordinated investment in R&D. We have to maintain, frankly, we need to maintain an immigration policy that allows us to continue to be the place in the world where smart young people who want to build businesses choose to come and do it. A crazy percentage of Silicon Valley founders and CEOs are not American born. That's a superpower for us. We should encourage that. So I think there are a bunch of things that the private sector in this part of the country can do to help advance our national power.
Thank you. And last question, sir. What are some of the leadership lessons you take forward in this role within the State Department?
So we talked about the difference between legal authority and moral authority. I think I think I described that commander I worked for who drank less and ate less and carried more and slept less. That was a real officers eat last kind of service leadership mindset that I think really is the kind of person I like to follow. Maybe one other thing. I'm a big fan of the social scientist Daniel Pink. He wrote a great book called Drive, which is about really what people want in their workplace. And he boils it down to 3 things. People want the ability to develop mastery, to get good at something and then to demonstrate that mastery. People want autonomy. They don't want their boss mucking around in everything they do. And they want a sense of purpose. They want to know why they're waking up in the morning and doing the thing they're doing. And so I think that's a pretty good set of principles for all of us who are trying to build cultures in organizations.
Hey, thank you very much. And reminding you, Thursday, Tim Shaw is going to do a great event with Don Fall as part of the Veterans Outreach Program. And someone was asking, were you guys contemporaries at all?
Donnie and I were in the 15th MEU together in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001.
All right, that answers the question.
Indeed.
And you can relax a little bit tonight because...
He has a way cooler job than me now, though.
Yeah.
CEO of CrossFit. Yeah.
Well, I hope you
He's going to be great.
Yeah.
He's going to be great.
We hope you stick around now that your boss, Secretary Blinken, Elvis has left the building. You can relax a little bit, right?
That's right. We had a little wheels up party last night. So.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation by the Marines Memorial Association and Foundation. To become a member, donate, or learn more about our upcoming events, our programs, and our organization, please go to the Marines Memorial website at www.mmaf1946.org. Thank you for your support.